This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we are going to speak with Silvia from the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, or PICUM as they're known. Silvia is going to tell us about the criminalisation and harassment of people on the move and activists working in solidarity with them across Europe in 2024. This is based on a report she wrote for PICUM earlier this year. It's quite a wide-ranging discussion. We talk about lots of different cases, so check out the show notes and I'll have links to more of these and to articles where you can find more information about them. And also we mentioned lots of people and lots of situations that have been covered in previous episodes of the Civil Fleet podcast. So check out the notes and you can find more on those. Right, so before we get into today's episode, I'd just like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, it's also a news blog with investigative stories, news reports and interviews and all sorts. So go to civilfleet.com to find out more there. Also, if you like what the Civil Fleet is doing and you would like to help us to continue to platform the awesome people that we have on this podcast, then you can help us out with a small donation. If you go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet, you can sign up to make a monthly donation there, a one-off donation. I think it's really low. I think it's only like £3 or something, maybe less, maybe £2, which is probably like €2.20 or something, and I don't know, $4 or something. So the costs are very, very low to keep the Civil Fleet running, but any help you can give us to keep the lights on, as it were, will be greatly appreciated. And if you can't do that, then you can help us out by sharing the podcast around, telling people about it, giving us reviews on all the podcast platforms and stuff, and just sharing us about on social media would be great. All right, that is enough from me. Let's hear from Silvia.
Let's go.
All right, I've just turned on my recorder. So Silvia, thank you very, very much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Thank you very much, Ben.
So you are from the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, which is shortened to PICUM, I think. So we're going to talk about a report that you worked on for PICUM about the criminalisation of migration and solidarity, which should be very interesting. But before we get started, Silvia, could you just tell us a bit about your background? I think you're in Belgium. But I don't know anything else about you. So yeah, I'd like the listeners to know a bit about the person we're interviewing. So can you tell us about yourself?
Sure. So I'm an advocacy officer and I work for PICUM that you just introduced, which is a big organization, a network organization actually, working specifically on undocumented migrants. But about myself, my position is in the advocacy team. So we work a lot with the EU institutions at the international level, but also at national level to a certain extent to advocate for better policies at EU level that can actually impact the lives of those who are undocumented. And I've been at PICUM for more than 3 years now, but my experience is mainly in the Brussels bubble, so working in research and advocacy, but I've also worked at the European Parliament in the past.
Oh, wow. What work did you do at the European Parliament?
I was an assistant to some MEPs. It was actually before Brexit. I don't know if you remember Majid. It was a very, very cool MEP. It was only for 5 months, but we had a lot of fun.
Oh, where were they from?
Majid was from the UK, and then after him, I worked for a French MEP for a while.
Oh no, I don't remember Majid. Which party was he from?
Sorry, the Greens.
Okay.
The Greens, back in the days.
Actually,
even though I think he was not part of the party officially, but that's a long story.
Okay. Well, it's interesting you work for the Greens as well, because the last episode, which will be the next episode of the Civil Fleet podcast, which is the one before this one. It's confusing. But anyway, that was about the Greens too, which interestingly, an interesting connection there. So where are you from, Silvia? I think you sound like you have a Spanish accent, but I'm not sure.
I'm actually Italian from Sardinia, so not far away from Spanish.
Okay, great. I try to guess sometimes, and normally I'm right, but this time I was wrong. But great. Oh, thank you very much, Silvia. And then, yeah, so PICUM, can you tell us, you kind of told us a bit about then. I think you work not just about migration, but other things as well, right?
Exactly.
And can you just give us a background of the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. As I told you earlier, PICUM is a network. So we work with members at national level. So there are like 155 organizations at the moment that are members of PICUM. And they started this project more than 20 years ago because they actually realized that there was a gap in terms of how EU policy would address irregular migration, but especially the situation and rights of undocumented migrants. So these organizations have started to work together and to cooperate, and they started covering a lot of different issues. And I think it's actually interesting that criminalisation was one of the first that they covered. So we've been there for over 20 years, I think now almost 25. And this Book of Solidarity was one of PICUM's first projects. But since then, we have developed and we now work across several areas, labor rights. I mean, we look at the rights for undocumented workers. We look at the specific concerns relating to children, but also their transition into adulthood. So how a person can lose the protection that they have when they are children and undocumented, and then what happens when they turn 18. We work on access to justice. So what does it mean to be a victim of a crime when you're undocumented? We also work on youth funding and the impact it has on civil society, but also, of course, on funding social services for undocumented people. So we do cover a lot of different areas, in addition, of course, to the mostly, let's say, what we mostly call migration enforcement policies, so deportations and detention, and basically all the migration pact, all the things that we hear a lot about when we talk about migration.
Okay, so does a lot of stuff, right? It focus on lots of things. And do you kind of does PICUM sit kind of between like the EU Parliament and like grassroots organisations? Do you kind of work with both groups?
Indeed, that's what we try to do, in the sense that our main interlocutors are, of course, the EU institutions, so the Parliament, the Commission, the Member States. But then, of course, through our members, we also work with national governments. We work, for example, with the UN bodies. But indeed, I mean, what PICUM wants to do is also to translate the experience of its members. So, and members are very diverse. Like, we have very big organizations, but also very grassroots, migrant-led members. So we try to basically keep in touch with them, to ask them questions, to get their input, and then to translate it basically into recommendations at the EU level. But when we can, to also directly involve them in this advocacy space.
And I can see, I think, from your report that I was reading, that we'll talk about later, I saw that lots of organisations that have been on this podcast are mentioned in there or linked to them. So that's I think we have so many organisations in common that we speak to. So that's good too.
Indeed. I think many of them, of course, we also follow and we just know about their work, and we also try to put it in our reports. Some are members, some are not, but they're all very close allies, let's say.
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the things I find so optimistic about the future is all these different groups that exist and they work together, and that they are all allies, and I think that's brilliant. That's a good thing. And so let's move on to the report then, Silvia. So your report was, I think it was titled Criminalisation of Migration and Solidarity in the EU. And it came out like 2 months ago, maybe? Was it May? I think it came out.
End of April.
And so let's talk. So there's quite a lot of factors. I don't know, maybe you can just give us a background into the report and why you wrote it, and then we'll dig deeper into it, I think.
Absolutely. So, I think the title is pretty straightforward, but this report basically covers cases of criminalization, both of migration and of solidarity with migrants. We look specifically at 2024, but this is actually the third annual report that we produce in which we compare criminalization cases across different countries. This actually started with a project that PICUM was part of, but then once this project ended, we realized that that we had a methodology for monitoring and counting criminalization cases. And we also saw that there was something, let's say, lacking at the EU level, because there are some countries where criminalization trends are very visible. And I think we'll talk about it, like Italy or Greece. But there are other criminalization situations that we don't know so much about. And especially when we look at this at the EU level, especially in terms of policies and legislation, we found it very important to really have an idea of how broad this phenomenon is, and not only in certain countries, which is basically how the report was born. And we cover different aspects of criminalization, which I think we'll have time to cover later.
And so which countries did you, was it like all Europe wide, or like did you focus on particular ones?
So ideally, we would love to cover the whole of Europe and even beyond, but then of course we rely a lot on media monitoring, because that's the easiest source at our disposal, as well as of course just reports and conversations with other civil society organizations. So this year I think we've been able to cover 8 or 9 countries. But we hope that we can, of course, enlarge that in the future. So we had Italy, Greece, Spain, which are the biggest, let's say, countries where we find criminalization trends. Then we had France, we had Poland, Cyprus, Bulgaria, Malta. But of course, this does not mean that there are no criminalization cases in other countries. For example, we decided not to cover the UK because we know that there is a lot happening there, but we just didn't have the capacity to really do it properly. But we have another project in the future that I hope will help us to actually be a bit more comprehensive.
Oh yeah, and if you ever do stuff on the UK, I'll get in touch with you and we can talk again. If that would be really interesting. An island would be interesting too. I don't know. I know that there's there seems to be protests against people on the move in Ireland that seem to be growing, unfortunately. So it would be interesting to know what's happening there too. Anyway, so yeah, that's quite broad, and yeah, Italy and Greece, like it's very obvious. You can. I've had people on this podcast that have been persecuted in those 2 countries. France, I didn't know too much about until I was reading your report, and I saw some cases there. And also Spain, I wasn't aware until I read the report that it was also happening a lot there. I know that some of the rescue ships have been blocked in Spain and prevented from leaving. But the case, I don't know, maybe we'll talk about it later, the case in the Basque Country, that I was like, how did I not hear about this? That was crazy, that one. So yeah, your report, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it kind of breaks down into 2 or 3 different areas, right? You look at the criminalization of activists or people acting in solidarity, then the criminalization of migrants, and then you also look at how these criminalizations occur, and also how they're also happen from non-judicial processes, so outside of the law, I guess. Is that right to say?
That's exact. I think that this division is a bit artificial. We had to do it to also explain and analyze the data. But of course, I would say that the criminalization of migration itself is the core issue. And then we see our criminalization of solidarity, but also other forms of harassment definitely stem from this criminalization of people in migration. So for us, it's very important to highlight that as the core issue. Then, we see that it's easier for people to understand criminalization of solidarity, especially those that are outside of our, let's say, civil society bubble. So we also try to use these examples to sort of raise awareness and potentially be able to speak about, let's say, more difficult topics for listeners who are not necessarily familiarized with the issue, as, for example, indeed, the criminalization of migrants themselves.
Mm. And so let's start with, so the Civil Fleet podcast is often focused on the criminalization of activists. And our website talks about that at the top. And also the tagline for the whole thing is "Solidarity is not a crime." So yeah, as soon as I saw your report in April, or maybe I saw it in May, that's why I thought it was May. When I saw it anyway, I was shocked by the amount of people that have been criminalized for acting in solidarity. I think you have 142. You found 142, right?
Yes. And that's the minimum number.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right. Because, and then you said you compiled all these numbers from media reports, right?
It's mainly media reports, so that's where we find most cases, especially when it comes to solidarity, because it tends to be a bit more in the media. But we, of course, also look at what other organizations are doing in terms of monitoring, and we try to incorporate it in our counting. Indeed, sometimes we might have different numbers and results, but this is also because of the way that we maybe categorize and analyze our data, because we really try to only count cases where we really have all the information we need. Unfortunately, sometimes we find reports which are very vague, and we try not to include them in the report unless we are really 100% sure about the case, the facts, and the issues at stake, basically.
How do you do with the language, actually? Like, I guess, like, because if you're doing this from not just media reports, but often they could be in different languages. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, we are lucky because we have a big network. So we have not only our members that can help us, but also a network of volunteers that work with PICUM, and they often send us cases from their national context. We are very good also at Googling like cases and using DeepL or the different translation tools to just Google different keywords. We have also alerts that just send us, notifications whenever a certain keyword appears in the media, and then from there, we normally try to do the translations ourselves. We're also a big team in Brussels. We have a lot of European languages covered. Then, of course, when it comes to maybe Polish or Czech or Lithuanian, there we might need to ask for help. But we normally, manage with DeepL and these other translation tools.
Yeah, I imagine in Brussels you're in the perfect place for all the different languages, right? So can you tell us about what did you find then about these 140, at least 142 cases of people facing criminalisation because of they were doing something decent and helping people? Can you talk to us? What did you find about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the aspects which is particularly interesting when we talk about the cases of people criminalized for solidarity is that we often imagine only search and rescue actors. And that's a very important part of the groups and people who are criminalized. However, I think what is also very interesting is to look at the different ways and the different actions for which people can be criminalized, not only at sea, but also at land. And in our report, we also try to break down the numbers. So to look at the are criminalized and to compare them with the charges that they basically have to face very often in court. And it's interesting because on the one hand, you see this very day-to-day simple activities, such as indeed providing food, providing water, providing shelter to people, but also very simply providing information, sometimes giving a passage to people. And then we see the charges, which are of course, mainly smuggling, so being criminalized as smugglers, but also terrorism and very, very serious charges, such as organized crime. So for us, it's extremely interesting to really draw the line between what people are actually doing and what they are accused of, which is often a very much overinflated image, which is also then, of course, exploited in the media. So I would say this is one interesting aspect that we cover. Also to mention another point, we also look at the proceedings themselves, like the duration. So any other details you might be interested in, we can also cover.
Yeah. But so I think in your report you kind of break down the cases. So was there 88 people I think that were accused that were criminalized for being involved in sea rescues. And then there's lots of other things, right? It's not, like you said, it's not just sea rescue, but there was one case you have in your report, which I don't know if it started in 2024. I think it started 10 years before, right? But someone, I can't remember where they're from now, they bought a train ticket for 2 Syrian people. I don't know, can you tell us about that? Because that blew my mind.
Yeah, this is also a case that we weren't aware of until recently, until basically the final judgment came out. And it was a woman that in, I think, 2014 or 2015 bought this train tickets for people, I think it was in Sicily. I mean, it was also the time where we saw like the big arrivals from Syria. So it was really a lot of people transitioning through Italy, maybe trying to go to Germany, to Sweden, to find their families. And people would just spontaneously help them. Like you find a family at a train station and they don't understand the system. They don't know how to get the tickets, and you just simply help them. And for that, she's been criminalized. And the judicial proceedings, I mean, this is incredible, lasted 10 years. I don't know the details of why, but I mean, of course, Italian judicial system is not the fastest in Europe, but still 10 years for such a simple act. I mean, imagine like the impact on your life not to be certain about the outcome for such a long period.
Yeah, that's crazy. And like, because it just made me think, I lived in Japan for a year, a long time ago. And people helped me buy train tickets a lot because I couldn't read Japanese at the machines. If you've ever been there, you might have this experience where you try to buy a ticket and someone will help you. And in that case, like this woman, she may not, whoever she was that bought the ticket for these Syrian people, she may not have even thought like, she might not be like, think down with the borders or anything. She might have just been like, I'll buy them a ticket. That is, I can't believe that one. That one really shocked me.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to ask people for their residence status before helping them, apparently.
Yeah, and that is a really dark situation, right? I couldn't believe how crazy that one was. And another case that really struck me was the case there was one in Bulgaria. Could you tell us? Do you know the one I mean? Could you tell us about that case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Bulgaria is a very particular situation. We've discussed it a lot with some of our allies and organizations which are actually involved in the case. So No Name Kitchen, but also an Italian collective called Collettivo Rotte Balcaniche. And these are groups of activists. They are often at the border with Turkey, so they are present there. They take some distress calls from people who are trying to cross, so very often in extremely difficult situations. And the cases that we report here are just the ones which made it to the press, the ones that are really the most striking, but they actually face in their daily activities and operations different forms of harassment and criminalization. But the case at hand, was particularly shocking, and there is also a report which explains the circumstances, which I really encourage you to read. It is quoted in our report as well, in which basically volunteers from these organizations received a distress call from three Egyptian teenagers, so very young boys, basically, that were alone at night in a very, very cold environment, basically. And they were blocked from rescuing them, despite themselves sharing GPS coordinates with the Bulgarian authorities. Nobody went to look for these three teenage boys. And unfortunately, they were found dead the next day. And there was a group of volunteers that would have been able to go and save them. And I think this is extremely tragic. But even, in these circumstances, the volunteers themselves were harassed, they were detained. The reports are really extremely distressing. So we see that this is just one example, but there were several episodes of arrest. Very often, no formal charges were actually filed against the activists, and this is also a technique which is used by the authorities to just harass and intimidate without actually bringing them to court. We see also that the authorities themselves adapt their techniques, because very often maybe a judicial case then, first of all, would require a lot of evidence. It would require also a certain, monitoring from the judicial authorities, whereas it's way easier for the police, for the border guards to actually intimidate people without having any consequences. But this changes from country to country, I would say.
Yeah, it seems like I suppose it is quite systemic and coordinated, I suppose, but there's a threat to people doing this kind of work of this kind of solidarity actions that you can be criminalised just for helping people, right? And it has a chilling effect.
So I would say that Italy is really the textbook case of authorities adapting and basically evolving their harassment against organization, indeed from judicial cases to actually using legislation and administrative sanctions to actually hinder the operations of civil society. I mean, the case of search and rescue NGOs, which I'm sure you've covered in this podcast, in much detail, is the most clear example, because we see that there has been really a proliferation of decrees of legislation that actually just creates more and more difficult conditions with crazy basically obligations for civil society to demonstrate that they are good faith humanitarian actors. And we see this declined in many different ways across Europe for sure.
Yeah, and it seems like the restrictions that they put on, I think in Italy, when they put restrictions on the refugee rescue ships, it's like, I just wonder, the only reason for doing this is to try to cut down arrivals, right? I think that's what they're doing. Like they seem to treat the refugee rescuers much different than they would other groups, I suppose.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, the ultimate goal would probably be to limit arrivals, but I'm not even sure if that's the reality. But if indeed it's just like a wicked attempt to punish also not only the people who are crossing the Mediterranean, but also the activists and NGO workers who are seen also as, I think, how can I say, political opponents, people also bringing a different kind of perspective to what it means to work in solidarity with other people. And I mean, Italy was the country where there used to be a search and rescue mission that was funded by the state, and now we ended up with the state actually criminalizing those that took over that role. Mm-hmm. So that's very sad.
Yeah, it's really sad. And the cases seem to, like, we talked about the case of the woman who bought the train ticket. And in your report, you also talk about the case that involved Save the Children, and I think MSF maybe were involved, and also the Juventa rescue ship. And like, there's lots of cases of very prolonged, like cases that take such a long time, right?
Yes, it did. I think in that case it was 7 years until the case was closed. And actually, that stopped the operations of some of the NGOs included. I think, for example, Jugendrettet, the German NGO that saw its boat seized. And then eventually in 2024, the court said that there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, and they sort of ordered the return of the ship, but the ship was useless. So we see there are really enormous consequences, not only for the people themselves who are part of these cases, but even indeed for NGOs. It's also a big reputational damage, which cannot be, undone, because even though there is a court judgment, there will always be people who will be convinced that these NGOs were actually, traffickers or smugglers or doing something wrong.
Mm. And I'll just to say for the listeners, you mentioned No Name Kitchen, and I just mentioned Juventa. We have previous episodes with those groups on the Civil Fleet. And in fact, last year I went to Bosnia with No Name Kitchen and saw like similar cases to nothing as bad as the case that you have in your report in Bulgaria. I never saw anyone dead there, but we saw people in very bad situations there, and then they all had reports of being abused by the authorities. Were there any cases in the report or any cases from last year that particularly stuck out to you, Silvia?
There were so many cases. I mean, if we look at solidarity, I think that an interesting case is one that concerns a French mayor from a little town that actually helped a person who was undocumented and who lived in their town to actually get some place to stay. He loaned his car. He gave him a bit of money when this man lost his job. and this mayor was actually judged guilty of facilitating irregular stay in the French territory, even though the court decided not to give him an actual penalty. And in the same case, also another man had tried to offer a job to the same person at a restaurant, but really didn't manage to get him regularized through his job, was also investigated. He was not judged guilty, but still went through all these court proceedings. And then I would say the cherry on the cake is that the undocumented person himself was put on trial because he was accused of arranging basically a sham marriage with a French woman to get status. And the couple lived together, they had a daughter. So it was really, a completely unfounded case. And we see how 3 people were actually criminalized. At least I think this case was in the news in France. Hopefully this story is quite striking and quite telling of the trends that we see. But there are so many other cases, also cases of people who are themselves migrants that of course are criminalized even for acting in solidarity. They're not always just criminalized for their own irregular migration, let's say, but also for acts such as saving other people during shipwrecks, or you probably know the case of the famous Ellie Blue Free, which is also going on since several years. But last year we saw that Malta, actually after 5 years, declared its jurisdiction on the case. So it's actually going forward, and these 3 former teenagers actually were considered terrorists for basically trying to prevent a pushback and trying to also mediate between people who were scared, who didn't know what was happening to them, and the crew of the boat. So they acted as translators. We consider really this as a solidarity case, right? As well. But unfortunately, we see that this is going on and on. And like the lives of these people are just put on hold.
Yeah, the El Hibli case is crazy. We have an episode with that campaign group. Someone from the campaign group spoken to us before. That is a crazy case. And then this Basque Country one. I like. So, can you tell us about that one if you can remember the details of that one? I thought that was like sounded great. I mean, obviously horrible, but it was a great moment of solidarity.
Absolutely. I think that case is a case that gives us a bit of hope because, we see in the Basque Country at the French border, there is a lot of solidarity movements, of organizations that are working to support migrants. And actually, there was this big race where a group of activists actually coordinated civil disobedience action. So they all sort of, during the race, helped 36 migrants to cross to France. And basically, they reclaimed it as an act of solidarity. Of course, 7 of them, the ones that were recognized as being, let's say, the main leaders of this terrible act, basically were even charged. But I think what was really heartwarming is that many other people actually signed a petition to declare themselves guilty of solidarity. So saying, we are all guilty, you should actually put all of us on trial, not just the 7 who are currently still in judicial proceedings. I think the hearing has been postponed. We won't know anything new until October this year. So let's see if the charges will actually be dropped.
There's a similar case in the UK, but we can't talk about that at the moment. But yes, that's that. I thought that was fantastic, and I'm going to try to contact that group. They sound really, really interesting. I don't know if they can speak, but that's another matter. That was really interesting. I thought the report did such a good job of highlighting these cases of people acting in solidarity and being criminalised for it. It's just so absurd. But also, we shouldn't forget that the report also highlights migrants themselves, people on the move, being criminalised for crossing the border. So can you tell us about that section of the report?
Absolutely. So we call this section people criminalized for crossing borders. And this is a deliberate choice that we do because despite the charges being smuggling charges, we see this criminalization merely as a deterrent, as a way to scapegoat people who are themselves migrating. Because in, let's say, the overwhelming majority of this case, people are criminalized indeed either because they themselves were on a boat, they were on a car, sometimes taking over some tasks, but in most of these scenarios, really just traveling alone or with their families to try to make the crossing to Europe. And unfortunately, I mean, of course, due to the fact that borders are entirely closed and militarized, these people have to undertake dangerous journeys. They pay very high amount of money very often. And what we see criminalized is really, first of all, the facilitation of one own's entry, but also then the facilitation of the entry of the other passengers, even though there is no coercion, there is no actual material gain, apart from the fact that the person potentially gets maybe a reduction on their passage, or in many other circumstances, it's really just people who are identified simply for being on board. There are these like interviews, especially at disembarkation, where the authorities ask for testimonies. They often also give incentives to people to testify. So you create a situation in which people are either compelled or just like really see a benefit in testifying, maybe because they are promised easier access to residence permits, they are promised not to be themselves criminalized. So we see really a lot of issues with the way that the investigations and trials are conducted. And we've actually counted only 91 cases. And I say only because even though we try to actually monitor and track the cases, it's way more difficult than for the cases of solidarity. So these cases are not in the media as much as the cases of activists and European human rights defenders. But these cases are only either tracked by civil society organizations, people who actually go to the trials and monitor the trials. But unfortunately, we see that this is really in the hands of grassroots, which have maybe limited capacity and limited funding. So there is also a very big gap there in the way that these people are eventually supported, because you can imagine like the amount of efforts, legal assistance, which is needed to support a person who arrives. They often maybe don't know why they've been arrested and stopped. And then get criminalized. So it's really a huge phenomenon, but still difficult to see in the numbers. But it's not only PICUM who does this work. And I think if we look at other organizations' data, we get a better picture overall.
Yeah, and one thing I find difficult is, like you said, it's harder to find these cases because they don't necessarily have as much voice, right? If it's a European person with lots of friends, or they're in a group that has like a social media presence, they're very much easier to contact and to find. I find that personally, so that's why it's easier to get Europeans onto the podcast to talk about how they've been criminalized for solidarity. But reaching out to the people on the moves themselves is much harder to find. Like, they can't make as big a noise, right, in Europe. So we've had a few people on this podcast. One guy who was on the podcast in 2023 was Somali, and he was arrested he was given a sentence of 142 years because he allegedly steered the boat across from Turkey to Greece. And it's just like, I find it just so completely insane. Like, what were the cases in your report that struck you the most, in that were like migrants being arrested or charged with smuggling?
Mm-hmm. So I would say the cases involving children, I always find them quite shocking. If you look at our previous report from 2023, there we had, I think we had a spotlight on 7 different cases, which all involved teenagers, which were eventually recognized as children, but that were all put in pretrial detention for very long periods, sometimes even in prison. So I would say that is I would say even more shocking than in normal circumstances due to the young age. Even this year in Spain, we had at least 2 cases of children that were put in prison. And in one of these cases, there was a need for the UN Child Rights Committee to intervene before this person was actually released. And then some other cases, which are, I think all cases are striking, right? Like we look at the stories where we have the most information, but whenever we really start looking and getting information about cases of migrants, there is always a story behind it. But maybe to really look at one of the cases where we had a spotlight, and these cases are super famous in Italy, but maybe not as known outside of it. I think the criminalisation of 2 women Iranian activists that were both fleeing persecution and domestic violence really made the news, because we saw these 2 women being held in prisons for months, one of them even being separated from her 8-year-old child. Eventually, both of them were released and were found not guilty. And this happened just like very close to the whole women life freedom movement. So we see these really strong double standards being used. And that was really, I would say, striking to me, especially because we're really looking at very young people, people who are looking for really applying for asylum, starting a new life, and just being put in prison in return.
Yeah, the hypocrisy in there is pretty striking, right? Because I think Italy, and I know the UK government was very much in favour of the women life freedom movement, but then once these Iranian people get here, then it's like, oh no, you're a criminal. It's awful, right? Just the hypocrisy really makes me angry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, it is easier when it's cases that talk about children or women. But again, there are also so many cases of men of all ages. I guess you are familiar with the case of Homayoun Sabetara. But a lot of even the fathers were criminalized for traveling with their children, for instance. Luckily now, I don't know if you've heard of this case in front of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which I hope will bring some more clarity, at least when it comes to caregivers and the fact that they should never be criminalized just for the fact that they travel with children or with any relative. But of course, it's way broader than that.
Mm. No, I'm not aware of the case that you talked about that's in front of the Parliament. Are they trying to make it not a criminal case to bring a child?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting one. And actually, there is an entire campaign. So maybe a suggestion for a future episode. The case is known as Kinsa. And it's also a crazy story about a woman that arrived to an Italian airport with her daughter and niece, both of them just children. And basically the woman arrived with false papers. So it was not even a case concerning a boat, but was really, she traveled by plane, but once she was found to have forged documents, she was actually arrested and prosecuted. She was even separated by her child and niece. I don't know if there is any development, I hope so, but at some point, the lawyers even lost track of the niece's whereabouts. So this woman who was in charge of these 2 children was separated from them and was prosecuted. Luckily, the case also was supported by a very brilliant lawyer, the same who worked on the Juventa case, by the way.
No.
And there was, Francesca Cancellaro.
Yeah,
and there was actually,
she's been on the podcast. She's amazing.
Yeah, she's really great. And basically the case ended up in front of the Court of Justice of the European Union because the lawyers challenged whether the criminalization of this woman was compatible with the EU Facilitation Directive, which is basically the legislative framework which allows for the criminalization of people for facilitation, because the current EU legislation only requires for any person to facilitate the regular entry of another person. Doesn't matter if there is exploitation, doesn't matter if there is a financial benefit. There should be, in theory, some humanitarian exceptions which are not applied. So basically, the lawyers challenged this principle, and the court ruled in favor of this woman. They ruled that the legislation should not criminalize when a caregiver, when a parent travels with their children, especially if these people are themselves asylum seekers, because of course there is further protection under international refugee law. So even though the judgment does not bring down the whole legislation, let's say, it does provide some very important guidance. And maybe just one more thing, the legislation is currently under review. So as PICUM and together with many other organizations, we are really also fighting for the legislation to be reviewed in a way that would really prevent criminalization. Probably very difficult in the current context, but we see that there are a lot of layers to the question of criminalization.
Yeah, that's really important. I should follow that case much more. And yeah, you just mentioned Homayoun Sabetara, and his daughter has been on our podcast. There was a campaign to get him out of jail. I can't remember what happened there. Is he out of jail now?
I think so. Yeah, he's out of jail. I don't think that the proceedings are over, but at least he was released.
Yeah, that's good. And yeah, I'm gonna have, for people listening to the podcast, I'll have links to all these episodes that I'm talking about. But yes, that case was pretty shocking. I think we should move on to the next section. So the next section that you had was about also. So what we're talking about is like the law being involved. But you had you also talk about some non-judicial harassment of NGO, well, people acting in solidarity. Can you tell us about that? Because that sounds pretty scary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cases we've discussed so far are cases where there is a certain threshold of severity, in the sense that they are all cases which ended up investigated or before courts, or where there were actual arrests. But these are cases which are mainly linked to individuals, whereas in the cases that we have basically counted under this harassment section, we look at a way broader phenomenon, which is either actions or, let's say, repression targeting NGOs, but sometimes also new forms of criminalization, which we haven't seen before, as, for example, this big spyware scandal in Italy that targeted a series of search and rescue actors and activists working on migrant rights. But then it can be very different things. For example, one of our members in Cyprus actually was targeted by a bombing attack in January last year. And this was after receiving a lot of threats, smear campaigns in the media. So even though it's not like it is not known who was responsible, what we see is that there was no institutional response. There was no real investigation taking place. So we see that there are a lot of circumstances under which civil society actors are not able to do their job without risks. And if not, I mean, it's also difficult to track all the instances because there are so many happening. Like just, for example, the police being constantly identifying and stopping civil society for checks. We see this especially in border areas. In Spain, in France, in Italy, really everywhere there's a border and there's police presence and people migrating. The organizations are constantly harassed. I mean, for example, very close to Brussels, at the French side of the border, close to the channel. I mean, we see that there is really an enormous amount of police harassment, violence. The French organizations really denounce very, very terrible instances of harassment against their volunteers, sometimes even being really forcibly stopped. There was a case that was reported, for example, by Utopia 56, where a volunteer's head was pinned against the steering wheel of a police car. The police even fired some blank shots. So really circumstances in which we can see how people volunteering, working for civil society might be themselves scared and intimidated.
Yeah, that's great. That's horrible. And we've had many people on the podcast talk about those kind of situations. The spyware case, that was, I don't know if you can expand a little bit on that, because that was so, That was such a big case at the time, but I was busy in my personal life moving house, so I kind of missed out on all of that. So I don't know if you could expand a little bit more on the spyware case if you can.
Absolutely. So basically, the spyware case concerned in particular one NGO, Mediterranean. So it's a search and rescue NGO, which co-founders got notifications, I think from WhatsApp itself, saying that their devices were monitored. And from there, a lot more people also started getting similar notification, including other activists. I don't know if you are familiar with the work of David Yambio, who is the founder of Refugees in Libya. He's also working very closely with Mediterranean. Even a priest, who is like the chaplain of Mediterranean, was targeted. So these people actually started getting this information that their devices were actually monitored. And this was actually, after some investigations, it was discovered that the software which was used by the Italian government, because actually then we found out it was the Italian government spying them, was an Israeli software, which is provided to Italian authorities. And initially, indeed, the government denied its involvement, which was actually later on confirmed. So the secret services were actually spying on Mediterranean and its activists under the pretense that they were doing something dangerous for national security. So I think that many of the details of this case are not yet known. I hope that now in the coming months we'll also get more clarity, but it's also very likely that this is not just about Mediterranean, but it might be basically spyware used against many other people working on search and rescue or just considered as actors where the government, I mean, sometimes this is also used to actually find some dirt, let's say, about people. It wouldn't be the first time. Many of the trials against search and rescue NGOs are also based on spying, even infiltrated agents on NGO ships, as you might remember, I think from the Eventa case.
Yeah.
So this could have very, very different implications.
Yeah, that's quite scary because I think a lot of those people, I have their phone numbers in my phone. So I remember hearing about that case and thinking, I really need to pay attention to this, but I was moving house then. Silvia, that was great. Thanks for telling us about all of that stuff. I think in the interest of time that we should move towards the end of the podcast, but before we do, was there anything else you wanted to talk about in the report? Was there anything I should have asked you but haven't asked you?
Maybe just some clarifications about the role of search and rescue NGOs, because all the cases that we heard about and the numbers, so this 142 people criminalized and 91 criminalized for migrating. Again, these are minimum numbers. And I think it's also very important to spotlight the work of the organizations which are actually supporting, especially people in migration who are criminalized. For example, in Italy, there is a group of activists which is currently supporting 128 people who are facing these charges. So Archie Porcorosso and Borderline Europe. And we see that even the number that they are working with in Italy is way higher than what we counted as PICUM. Unfortunately, we don't have the details about all these cases to be able to include them in our reports. But just to say, if this is in one country, we can imagine how broad the phenomenon is. And data about Spain and Greece confirms the same trend. So the 91 cases could actually be 300, 400, 500 very, very easily. So I think this is very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I like how your report highlights that and says, you say there's just at least 91 migrants, and these numbers are not high enough. I think that's really good to point out because we don't know. I suppose we don't know the full picture, do we, of what's happening here?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so. I would like to ask people at the end of the podcast to tell us how they feel about the future in regards to migration and solidarity and all this kind of stuff. Sylvia, how do you feel about the situation at the moment? and the future?
It's difficult to be hopeful, especially while sitting in Brussels, because so many horrible things are happening at political level. I mean, today we've discussed criminalisation, but there is this massive proposal on migrants' deportations on the table in Brussels. It was proposed in March, and it's really something which could lead to practices which are very similar to what we see in the US, so detection, raids, reporting obligations, but also very, very strong punitive measures against people in an irregular situation. And we can also imagine, of course, the consequences on civil society. So I think with this development, it's very, very difficult to look at the bright side. But I mean, there are some other maybe things happening, as for example, the revision of this framework on criminalisation, where we hope that we can at least get some safeguard. But I would say what is always, let's say, the silver lining is that there are so many people, activists, grassroots, who are really coming together and who are really there on the grounds, supporting people, making sure that these stories are actually heard. We only do a work of amplification and reporting, but they are really doing the most important work. And I would say, unfortunately, what we see is that there is always a lack of funding for people working on the ground. So maybe if anyone is listening, any funder, that would be, I think, a very, very good way to invest some money to support litigation, to support assistance to people who are criminalized, especially to all these people who are actually in prison. Basically only for the fact of migrating. So well done to all the people working on the ground, and let's hope that we can see some changes also at the legislative side.
Yeah, I hope so. It just feels like we're heading in a very dark direction, right? But like you said, the work of other people the people that oppose this and oppose that vision of the future give me a lot of hope. Well, Silvia, that was a really great episode. I feel like we could go longer, but I've got to get to some other things. So thank you so much for your time, Silvia. That was a really great interview. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you, Ben.
Okay, that was episode 74 of the Silver Fleet podcast. Thank you very, very much for listening. Thanks, Silvia, for coming on the podcast. Thanks to PICUM and to their press person, Gianluca, for organising it all. You should definitely check out PICUM's work. There are links in the show notes to their website and their social media platforms as well. At the end of the podcast, I'd like to remind you to check out the Silver Fleet blog. Go check out silverfleet.com and you'll find our news reports on there, some investigative stories and some interviews and all kinds of stuff. Also, if you like what the Silver Fleet is doing and you would like to help support us to keep the lights on and to help us to continue to platform all the amazing people we have had on here, then you can go to ko-fi.com/silverfleet. That's ko-fi.com/silverfleet, and you can make a small donation there, and that will help us keep going. And you also get a free bonus episode on there too. Well, I guess it's not technically free, but anyways, that is it for now, and I will see you soon. Cheers. Bye bye.